Looking back, it seems that the 90s was the supercar equivalent of the startup scene. A plethora of pumped-up prototypes were presented to the public in the hope that a flood of deposits would enable production to begin. While most would vanish without a trace, there are a few that actually managed to make it out of the designer's dreams and onto the road. "12 cylinders good. 16 cylinders better?" The decade had barely begun before the most excessively 90s supercar ever went on sale. It was the brainchild of former Lamborghini engineer and at the time Beverly Hills-based car dealer to the stars, Claudio Zampoli, who had long cherished the idea of building his own boutique supercar. Zampoli realized that for his Hollywood target market, a celebrity partner was essential for attracting column inches. Initially, Sylvester Stallone was interested, but eventually Italian synth legend Giorgio Moroder's name was added to Cizeta, the Italian pronunciation of Zampoli's initials. The former engineer also decided that a mere V12 wouldn't get nearly enough attention, and devised a V16 based around the block of the Lamborghini Urraco V8. The 6-litre V16 had 64 valves, 8 camshafts, twin fuel injection systems and timing chains, and 4 cylinder heads, producing 547 horsepower and 550 Newton-meters of torque. It was mounted sideways in the chassis in front of the gearbox, hence the T element of the car's name, and making it wider than a current Aventador. The V16T was styled by Marcello Gandini and riffed off his original design for the Lamborghini Diablo with input from Zampoli and no less than 4 pop-up headlights. Painstakingly hand-built, it was priced comparably to today's hypercars and hit the market just as the early 1990s recession, hit the market. Somewhere between a dozen and 20 were made, including at least one convertible. And the car is still listed on the Cizeta website, priced at $800,000. The idea of a supercar from Eastern Europe isn't quite so far-fetched these days after Mate Rimac unveiled the groundbreaking Concept 1. Launched just a couple of years after the Velvet Revolution, the Tatra MTX V8 was perhaps even more surprising in its day. The third oldest vehicle manufacturer still in continuous production, Tatra is perhaps best known for its quirky streamliners and limousines with rear-mounted air-cooled V8s. Created with race preparation company MTX, consider them a Czech prodrive. The car took Tatra's 3.9-litre air-cooled V8 and mounted it in the middle of a supercar-esque wedge styled by famed industrial designer Václav Král. Unveiled at the 1991 Prague Motor Show, the car immediately attracted a flurry of 200 orders. Sadly, just 4 cars, 2 of which were prototypes, were built, before a factory fire destroyed the tooling. An SUV with many hundreds of horsepower is barely worth a second glance these days. But nearly 30 years ago, there was only one. Founded in 1938, Axam was, and still is, a manufacturer of those oddball microcars which French laws allow one to drive from the age of 14. After making these for less than a decade, someone in the company's management obviously heard the maxim, "Go big or go home," and took it to heart. The result was the Mega brand, and its first car, the Track. And it really was big, weighing well over 2 tons and being more than 2 meters wide and around 5 meters long. That length was accounted for by the fact that its wheelbase contained a 2+2 cabin and also a longitudinally mounted 6-litre Mercedes V12. The car drove all 4 wheels through a 4-speed automatic, had nearly 13 inches of ground clearance, and looked a bit like a cheese-dreamed Lotus Esprit. you seemingly couldn't wander around a motor show in the 1990s without tripping over the low-profile shape of a supercar based on the Porsche 962. As well as the Dauer, there was the Schuppen 962, the DP Motorsports 962, and the C62 from Koenig of twin-turbo Testarossa fame. The Dauer was the only one good enough to actually go back and win Le Mans again, 7 years after the original Porsche's last victory. The Dauer 962 was based on stripped-down Porsche 962 bodies, which had their panels modified, a passenger seat added to the now leather-trimmed cockpit, and a frunk for carrying a small, very small, suitcase. Like the Racer, the Dauer was powered by a twin-turbo 3-litre flat-six, but, freed of race restrictions, was actually more powerful, producing 730 horsepower. Then, in 1993, the FIA reintroduced a production-based GT class, which had no homologation limit, but cars had to be able to carry a passenger and luggage. To race, the Dauer required narrower tyres, a larger fuel tank, and to have its engine restricted once more. With full support from Porsche, the Dauer Le Mans competed in the 1994 running of the race after which they were named, finishing first and third. The Di Tomaso Pantera is one of our favourite supercars, and possibly the world's most plentiful, having been in production for decades. Odd then, that with all that experience, Di Tomaso should have got its replacement so wrong. The Guarà was based on the Maserati Barchetta, produced in the early 90s for a one-make race series. Alejandro Di Tomaso still owned a 50% stake in Maserati, but sold it to Fiat in 1993, with one of the conditions being that he retained the rights to build a road-going Barchetta under his own name. The Guarà shared the Barchetta's aluminium honeycomb chassis, race-derived inboard suspension, and unassisted braking and steering. The car swapped the Maserati bi-turbo V6 for, at first, a 4-litre BMW V8, and then later a 4.6-litre Ford unit. Tipping the scales at just over 1,000 kilos, the Guarà's performance was impressive, but its styling was awkward. And in total, just over 50 cars were built and delivered.